Is this working? Hello, it is. I can hear myself. Hi, everyone. We're going to get started. Thank you for joining us for the Day 3 presentation of the SPLICE Institute. We're very excited to welcome Flannery Cunningham, who is... She is a SPLICE board member, as you probably know, and the SPLICE faculty. She's worked with a bunch of amazing ensembles like TAC Ensemble and Yarn Wire, ICE. She won the Hildegard Commissioning Award. When was that?
2020?
2020, all right. And just generally done amazing things, written amazing music. And she has written what she is loosely describing as an opera, which we will now hear more about. So welcome, Flannery.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you for being here despite the slight tiredness at this stage of the week in SPLICE. So as Per mentioned, I'm going to be chatting with you all about what I'm deciding I'm calling a chamber opera called Groundwater. But I wanted to take a leaf out of Anne and Ted's book. Anne, I thought, so beautifully sort of told a story about how she got to be the artist that she is, and Ted gave us some really beautiful openness about his process. So in an attempt to emulate that, I'm going to start with somewhere very different, which is my first encounter with medieval music. I have given some spoilers already to some of you over lunches, but I started studying medieval music in my third year of undergrad as a grumpy, bad-mannered composer who did not want to take music history and decided if she had to, she was going to at least get a real skill out of it. So I took medieval notation. This was the first piece of medieval music I ever engaged with. It's an Alleluia. These are called undiastomatic neumes. They basically give a little sense of the local contour of the line, but the height on the page, unlike contemporary Western notation, doesn't necessarily indicate pitch in the same way, only on a local level. Here's a little bit of what this sounds like. When I hear that and I look at this notation, it makes perfect sense to me. This is a recall notation. This is a notation that jogs your memory. It does not perfectly encode that music. You cannot give this notation to somebody who doesn't know that piece of music. But if you have learned it orally and aurally, this will help you perform that music. So studying the development of Western notation in medieval music, studying medieval music's cultures of borrowing and reworking, studying the particularities of manuscripts, totally changed so many things about how I work as a composer. And I think also in some ways about how I work with electronics. So I conceive of myself now as having a number of sort of shared concerns between my musicological work in the 13th and 14th centuries and my work as a composer. One of those is notation. I'm interested in the sort of visual signification of notation, maybe opening that up to be part of the audience's experience. Thinking about what reading means for various notational forms. Those recall notations, to borrow a term from Susan Rankin. I'm very interested in vocal expression. Even when voices aren't literally present in my music, they're often there some way, whether it's through formant values or sort of quasi-vocal samples. And I'm interested in vocal repertoires from the 13th century through Irish and no singing, American shaped note singing. I also write a lot of my own texts. Some of you have heard my SparkNotes version of how it was Guillaume de Michaud, the 14th century composer, kind of opened that up for me and made me feel like that was something that I could do and that was a productive thing to do. And I think both for Michaud and hopefully now for me, that allows for particularly close music-text relationships that would be very difficult to achieve if you were working with a second poet or librettist. And then I'm very interested in materiality, manuscripts, textiles, other materials. So as you'll see in a minute, and as the folks in my tangible and intangible workshop have been seeing throughout the week, this piece includes a whole bunch of sort of physical materials that are manipulated over the course of the piece. Here's a little example of one of these physical materials in the medieval world. These are manuscript curtains. They're little bits of cloth that cover up images, sort of like a Lift the Flat book. This one's popular in my house right now. And they work very similarly in that they reveal the image underneath. So I've spent hours poring through manuscripts for threads that are left and little stitch holes that indicate this. And I think there's some really powerful things that are done to the medieval sort of reading and oralizing, imagining the sound of the music that's notated in manuscripts experience because of these. Whoop. I'm also very interested, let me skip back. I'm also very interested in compositional process, both as a scholar and as a composer myself, especially how I and medieval composers, and any composers, choose to integrate pre-existent textual, musical, and sonic material. So when we're taking a little bit of a melody or text from somewhere else, what sort of sonic and symbolic work does citing that do? You know, when we're borrowing stylistic aspects of some genre, what does that do? And then when we take those pre-existent materials and we sort of adapt them into the context of our own music, what do we do with that? When do we adjust the material? When do we adjust the context that we are composing? You know, when do we just let things be crunchy against each other in either a pitch or a rhythmic sense? And I think, you know, medieval composers were masters of this. For instance, there's a whole thing in this really amazing manuscript called FR 25566 where they do like these amazing sort of like auralizations of love triangle moments in this really raunchy story about this fox named Renard, that they use always this three-voice song that's like a self-consciously three-voice song. So the sort of three members of the love triangle are in some way singing together there. The piece you'll hear tomorrow night, that Robin will be playing, actually traces a network of these kind of shared materials through a whole bunch of medieval works. So there are these little bits of shared music and text called refrains, and those circulate between a whole bunch of different pieces in the long 13th century. And I basically said to myself, what if I trace that network? What if I say, okay, I can only ever use material from the next refrain if it's in a piece with another refrain. So I go from this particular refrain, which we call VDB 1375, in one piece to that refrain in another piece, to then another refrain that occurs in that same second piece, and sort of trace through this network. And I found this a kind of powerful way to like make myself have to deal with very limited compositional choices melodically, and then figure out how to grapple with that. So, with that as a kind of like perhaps a master key to some of my concerns as a composer, I'd like to chat about this piece called Groundwater. When I started it in 2019, I wasn't really thinking of it as an opera. I think it has become at least something akin to an opera. So it is a piece for solo singer, for instrumentalists, electronics, video projections, and physical materials. So I'd like to first just do a moment of shameless self-promotion. If you find yourself in Chicago, on the way back from SPLICE perhaps, on this Sunday afternoon, you could catch the very last performance. Thompson Street Opera, a little wonderful opera company in Chicago, is currently putting it on. I caught the first two performances, and they're doing a really beautiful job of it, and it's cool to see what a stage director does with your work. The piece is inspired in many ways by Rachel Carson's work of environmental science, Silent Spring, which is sort of instrumental in the banning of DDT pesticide in the US. You don't need to read all this, you can if you like, but I was really struck by the way that Carson is a master of sort of poeticizing these really pressing environmental concerns. And I was really interested in the way that she discussed groundwater in particular. And it felt to me that the way that she sort of conceptualized groundwater, there's a latent kind of metaphor of groundwater as memory under the hood for Carson, I think. And that started feeling really rich and productive for me. You know, the stage director, Claire DeVizio, who's directing the piece with Thompson Street, said, this piece feels more to me like the fever dream you have after watching the environmental documentary than the environmental documentary. And I think I'm pretty happy with that as a note. I'm not trying to be didactic about this, but the piece is both about a sort of true environmental concern and then also about groundwater as this kind of way of thinking through cyclicality and recurrence and dispersion and persistence in our lives. So I'd like to play you just the first 5 minutes of the very first version of the piece that I did in 2019. Actually, not the very first 5 minutes, but a 5-minute excerpt of the opening.
As it falls on the
So, oh, thank you. So there are a few things going on there, right? First of all, technically from an electronics perspective, it's super simple, right? There's no processing on any of the instruments there, just on the voice, and it's basically pitch shifts, reverb, and delays. And then there's some quasi-vocal samples that happen when the cloth is pulled from the piano. The emergence of the cloth from the piano, so what's going on is the cloth is sort of stuck down between the action, and there is dye on little felt pads on each of the hammers. So that image that you get on the cloth is a kind of, a kind of compression in time of the sort of image of the gesture that the pianist does. And I was really interested in that kind of collapse of time, and also in the way that then the gesture gets imprinted as something visual that then can potentially be used as notation, again, in the piece. The vocal processing comes out of a patch that I built for performing myself. This was like the first version of it. It got a lot user-friendlier after this very first version, but basically big banks of pitch shifts that I could bring in and out really quickly, and sort of change the shift level on. This is not any sort of groundbreaking technology, but I found it a really powerful tool for myself, especially when I was really thoughtful of the timing about when I brought shifts in and out. So you'll notice I never ever let the singer have a shift on when she's singing a consonant. She has to always, if she's singing as rain, if there's supposed to be a shift on rain, she has to get the R out, turn on the shift on A, and then get the shift out again for and it's incredibly virtuosic to have to do as a performer, but you get these really lovely sort of chords that emerge from the vowel resonance then, without getting the kind of Mickey Mouse comedic effects that you get when you pitch shift consonants. I also realized very quickly you have to simplify for a performer who's not somebody who's worked with a patch for months or years. So this is what it looked like for the singer, much, much simpler. In the section where the piano cloth is being printed, there's some quasi-vocal samples. Those are recordings of me sort of singing into a piano, and then the resonance back from the strings. So you get a kind of impression of the vowel because of like which strings resonate in the formants, but it's not a sort of literal recording of a voice. So here's one of them. A little artifact there. And then here's another. You can hear that second one, different quality, that's my E. The cloth ends up looking like this because we use the same cloth for every performance. The first time I ran it, or actually the second time I ran it, I didn't remember that I need to orient the cloth the same way each time, so I got a kind of mirror image of the gesture. I ended up really liking that because somebody said to me, wow, it actually ends up looking like a DNA strand, which given the sort of thematic material of the piece, I liked. B, this later gets read as notation, and it sort of increases the complexity of the gesture. And I like that the piece has a memory of itself, that every time this piece gets done, there's something new added to it that then impacts future performances. So this cloth, as folks from my tangible workshop have seen, is in fact later read as notation by another performer. So Anya, the pianist there, is moving her hand above a lead motion sensor. She's tracing the sort of contour of that backdrop. I give her some directions for how to do that. That sort of are a little bit more prescriptive at first and then become looser over the course of the movement. and the height of her hand at any moment sets the rate of that pulsation on the clarinetist's sound. So the processing is based on the reading of the notation of the backdrop. There are other ways that I read things as notation that wouldn't traditionally be read as notation in this piece. We've been playing with the Chladni plate for a couple days in my workshop. A Chladni plate appears in this piece. If you're not familiar with what that is, it's basically a flat, sort of thin sheet of metal that is vibrated by the action of a speaker cone. If you pour salt or sand on top of it, the salt or sand vibrates towards the nodes and away from the antinodes, and you get different patterns depending on the frequency content that you're sending to that speaker. So given the sort of thematic material of water in the piece, I was really interested in kind of using this almost like a kind of weird version of like a divining rod and looking for water. And so I spent a lot of time playing with what material gave me interesting patterns on the plate, and then using that both to drive the sort of poetics of the text, and then also drive some live processing on the violists, cellists, and occasionally the singer's sound, based on some computer vision parameters of a video feed of the plate. So I'll give you just a tiny little bit of a sample, with the caveat that I needed to replace the amplifier for the plate for this, so the Chladni plate is not super impressive in this video. You gotta come on Sunday if you want to see it looking good.
Anyone has dreamed, everything anyone has feared has sunk down there.
At the very opening of that, there was a little, it might have been super audible in this recording because of the mix, but I will play it for you in a second. There's a little bandpass filter on the cellist's sound with a center frequency that is set by a sort of calculation of the number of edge pixels in the incoming video. This, I think, is a good example of a moment where I did the thing, I loved how it sounded, and then I said, do I want to stress about high Q bandpass filters in live performance? No, I do not want to stress about that. And I like the version of what I've gotten. I don't think that this is sort of controllable enough variability on the part of the cellist that it's productive or at least necessary for me to do this live. So I made a little recording of it, and that recording gets triggered, and I'm very happy with that decision at this point in my life. So here's a little sample of that. This is above the cellist low C. I think for me, the piece is so much about these kind of themes of borrowing and recycling and return and cyclicality, often with some kind of transformation of that. And electronics, provide a useful tool for that kind of transformation. Obviously, there's other sorts of compositional and musical transformation in the piece. But some of the particular ways that you can affect transformation with electronics felt exciting to me. So this is an excerpt from Movement 2 that I'll play you a little bit of.
Cadmium, oil, lead, arsenic, iron, the bones of the dead, mercury, chromium, lead, first tears, threads, the ghosts of the dead, cadmium, oil, lead, arsenic, iron, the bones of the dead.
So there's this sort of crunchy texture of retuned string harmonics. Those have been retuned. I went through and sort of analyzed the singer's voice, retuned harmonics to the formant values of all of her vowels that she speaks in this section of the piece. And then basically I'm doing pitch tracking, and either her fundamental pitch or her sort of first 3 peaks in the spectral profile can trigger periodically the retuned harmonic that is closest to that. So you get this kind of, you know the overall harmonic material of the section, but the actual sort of composition out of the texture is something that happens live in the moment and is different every time. Here it recurs again in movement 10. Sorry, I should have had a video there, but anyway, little the version from movement 2, or one version. And a possible version for movement 10. Sorry about the one missing video. There would have been a very nice, pretty texture for movement 10 for you to hear. Again, come on Sunday and you can hear it. Throughout the piece, I'm also interested in integrating other kinds of pre-existing materials, particularly from some vocal repertoires that have influenced me and which I just really love. So, Shanno singing is a form of Irish, unaccompanied, highly ornamented singing sung in Irish. This is a Shanno song that I grew up with. This is it's a beautiful song. It's called, the English translation is something like Bright Vision. It's a sort of vision or dream song about a sort of figure of a woman who comes to the narrator. And this piece, this piece is not linearly narrative, but there is a kind of loose narrative, I think, about matrilineage in there, about my grandmother coming to this country, about memories with my mother, about myself, about my daughters, about an imagined daughters of my daughters. And so for me, the sort of figure of the woman in this piece ends up being sort of part of that story. So she comes in again, or comes into the piece first in movement 5 in a very sort of talked into the texture way that I'll play for you now. So basically, the 3 players together there, each of their pitches tracked, and they've got these little cells that they have to repeat. until they have spent enough time on each note of that Ashland Gal melody to trigger this long tone. So they have to sort of work together to coordinate bringing out the movement is called As a Ghost Before You on the Road, is a sort of slightly mistranslated line from the song. So they have to work together to sort of bring out this ghost. So we got the sort of first 4 pitches of the ghost there in that excerpt. Later on, the piece comes in much more audibly in the penultimate movement. Here's some return of text from the first movement as well.
As rain falls on the land, it seeps down deep into the ground, bears us to our ground.
We did get a little of the other version of the retuned string harmonics in there after all. So the vocalese over that texture, which I'll talk about in a minute, is from Ashland Gal. That texture is pulled very much from sacred harp or shape note singing, which is an American style of singing that developed from some forms of singing from Ireland and the UK, which uses 4 syllables with different shapes to sort of ease the process of learning for people who don't necessarily have a lot of musical experience. Though for those of us used to a 7-syllable solfege system, it's actually harder to do. And it has this very sort of shouty, very raw timbre that I find totally intoxicating. And this ethos of like, you don't come and listen to a singing, you participate. There is only participation, and you come as you are. We don't try to blend. The only blend we try to do is tuning. We want to be in tune together, but we want to use, our natural voices.
A few hundred feet away.
So there you can hear those pitch shifts coming back to create this kind of sacred harp texture that then the singer can go on to sing over. And the pitch shifts, I think, are a moment where like the kind of calculation about liveness that I mentioned before fell totally the other direction, right? I would never dream of doing pre-recorded shifts where tight timing is important, because it just is not possible to do it in a way that feels persuasive and real. So that's a literal version of an actual sacred harp tune. Later on, I have my own sort of own version where I'm not just quoting an actual example of the genre, but I'm sort of pulling on some genre identity and drawing on stylistic threads from sacred harp. So you would have heard a little bit of that in my missing video. It's also a very sort of wonked up multiphonics version of it is in that solo clarinet movement where the person was doing the lead motion sensor. So I think a few takeaways for me from my work here, if there has to be a moral of the story for us. First, I think transforming material with electronics can be a really powerful compositional tool, right? It's not just about the technical, like ooh, I can do really cool live processing and this other really cool live processing, but it gives you an ability to transform material in a way that can be a really striking compositional tool. Simple technically doesn't necessarily equal simple sonically. Like, you can restrain your means, and that is okay. And it's good to sort of balance a desire for liveness against the costs of liveness, right? Liveness is exciting, it's performative, it's persuasive, it's risky, it's awesome. And then the moments where it doesn't feel like it's adding something either for the performer or the audience, I think you have to ask yourself seriously, why is this live? And if there are sort of improvisatory elements or ways that, you know, you are putting agency in a performer's hands, that can often be a very persuasive use of liveness. But if it doesn't make a big difference for your performer, if they're not directly controlling something and feel the kind of agency of that control, and it doesn't make a big perceptual difference for your audience, then, you know, maybe you want to make your life a little simpler and make it an audio file. And this is a view that would have been total anathema to me when I came as a participant to SPLICE. You know, anybody who was here, I think in 2017, would have heard some of those high Q bandpass filters on Adam's bass drum inputs and would have heard the big booms that sometimes resulted. You know, obviously I got better technically. You know, I can realize that piece live now through the wonders of compression and limiting, but it still keeps you on the edge of your seat a little bit in a way that I think you have to ask yourself seriously about, you know, do you want to do that and is it worth it? So with apologies for my one missing video, which I will be happy to chase if you would like, I would also love to have a little bit of a discussion with you all. So thank you. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Definitely. Yeah, I probably should have spoken this a little bit more earlier because it's a great question. So the very first version of the piece in 2019 was like 11 minutes long. And it was almost a kind of proof of concept for myself of like, does this piano printing thing work? Is it worthwhile? Can I kind of build a piece around the kind of emergence of material from this piano and then rework it in other ways? My answer to that ended up being, yeah, I think it's cool. I think it's worth doing. So then, over the course of the next couple of years, I built it out into an hour-long piece. So that premiered in a kind of, you know, self-produced version that most of these videos were from in 2022. I still wasn't necessarily thinking of it as an opera then. I was thinking of it as like, you know, perhaps not just a concert work because there is a really sort of multimedia and multisensory experience there, but not, you know, as something that had loose narrative but wasn't necessarily intended to be dramatized. And then it was small opera companies that were interested in the piece, and I sort of said to myself, okay, let's see what somebody else does with it. I'm interested in this. So I worked with Thompson Street. They were wonderful. They spent 2 years writing grants to buy microphones, preparing. They had not done a piece with this sort of amount of gear requirements, or, you know, I called it a piece without a lot of technical complexity from the community that we're working in. In the broader world, this is a lot of technical complexity. So they were really great about preparing for it, and over the course of those 2 years, I got the chance to make some revisions. And I think that was really to the benefit of the piece. I didn't make massive revisions, but the ones that I did felt pretty impactful. You know, this was one of those pieces that got affected by COVID pretty badly. So the first version of the piece, you maybe could have seen sort of over the pianist's shoulder there. It was basically a text score, and we worked a lot out in rehearsal together. And I loved working that way. It was the first time I had ever worked that way. But then I didn't really get to write large sections of the rest of the piece that way because we weren't able to meet in person when a lot of the sort of critical compositional process was happening. And so coming back to the piece with some remove, some sense of like, okay, now this is going to be staged with a set and a stage director, and they're going to have to find, again, even if the narrative isn't linear, some sort of threads to pull on. It let me sort of come back with that perspective and say, okay, what does this need now to sort of tie up some of those threads? So I added in the final movement, that had no text for the singer, or a tiny bit of text in the middle that you heard. but I added some extra material to that final movement with some text that I felt kind of, summed up some of the kind of themes of the piece in a way without putting kind of too fine a point on it. And that, now I got the chance to hear it twice, and that felt really successful to me. So yeah, it's a great question. I think it's hard to get your head back in the world of a piece that you've done and you've left aside for a while, and it felt difficult to get the wheels turning, but once I did, I was really happy that I had. Yeah?
I'm curious if, because of your voice musicologist, if you ever worked with, I first thought of it as like period instruments or period instrument sounds, and thinking of what it's going to be a company if you could get your samples or performance using gut strings and things like that.
Yeah.
But then also I thought of Dr. Identity and the hunger and how he uses bringing that over the tradition of his like Irish.
Yeah.
Who's an Irish consonant singer. Who didn't know the music and he talks about it in your interview how he would like sing a song and he had an ensemble and that guy's kind of like go with him.
Yeah.
It's a completely different experience. So I'm wondering if you ever thought about that, like incorporating those elements of electronics or working with specialized singers outside of the classical and specific with other styles.
Yeah, 100%. Danica is one of my favorite composers. I actually manage him at Schirmer. I love The Hunger. It's a docu-opera, for those who don't know it, about the hunger, the Irish famine. And the singer is, in fact, the same Shanno singer that I played for you earlier in this presentation, Irlo Leonard, who plays in a band with my cousin and is a wonderful fellow, and it is one of my dear ambitions in life to write for him someday. So absolutely, that is something that I've considered. In terms of period instruments, it's a really interesting question that I think maybe somebody else this week has asked me. I'd certainly be game. My dad plays a hardanger de more, which is a kind of like hybrid viola violin with the understrings of a Norwegian hardanger fiddle, and that has a couple of gut strings, and I really love the sound. For me, as a musicologist, that would be cool, but not really sort of related to the work that I do in the medieval period, because I basically only deal with vocal music, and it is really about voices and about not only the voice's ability to carry text, but how voices work, even in untexted things like hockets. And so I love period instruments, but they're frankly something that I haven't engaged with a lot to date. So maybe for the next project. Thank you. Jacob?
I'm curious about the connection of that particular shape note, tune and lyrics
Yeah.
to the concept of the piece, with memory, but also with environmental decay.
Yeah.
Because on the surface, I see a connection that it is about death,
Yep.
but it's also a very different perspective on death.
Yeah.
Right, from a Christian perspective and a very like American Appalachian Protestant Christian perspective.
Yeah.
What was your thought process in integrating that into the piece, and how did it connect to the themes?
Yeah, that's such a beautiful, thoughtful question. I am not Christian, and yet I am obsessed with Sacred Harp, and especially its forthright acceptance of death. I think I have found this very sort of therapeutic in my life. So yeah, that tune is, and am I born to die and lay my body down? So it's totally this like, all right, I'm gonna die. And there's something that felt powerful about that to me, especially in combination with the rawness of the vocal timbre. And I think this piece, because of the sort of recurrence and cyclicality, I both found that a sort of comforting idea. When my 4-year-old asked me what happens after we die, I tell her this story about like, well, we don't believe there's a heaven, but your atoms get recycled into other things. Like there is a sort of comforting idea in that nothing ever truly disappears, everything persists in some way. And yet, of course, in the context of environmental catastrophe, it's a terrifying idea, right? Any contaminant in the environment can only ever really disperse. We never really truly mitigate anything. We just spread it out or contain it and encapsulate it. So I think I found the kind of acceptance of the Sacred Harp tradition, despite me having a very different view of the afterlife, a really profound and exciting one. Thank you. Yeah? Yeah, absolutely. So this is very much, I think, an evolving area of practice for me. So one of my next projects, I'm working with a really wonderful installation artist on an installation, or actually a performation, a piece that will be sort of both a performance piece and then activated, an installation piece and activated in a moment of performance, where we're doing a bunch of really big cyanotypes that are developed with projectors. And there, you know, I'm very interested, it's like cyanotype-treated fabric. I think I probably have some, here's some images of me testing like exposure lengths for the cyanotypes. I was like, you know, thinking that 120 minutes would cut it. You need at least 3 hours. So I'm interested in sort of physical processes that dictate something about my music making or the duration of my music making. I'm also interested in sort of materiality that is tied to that music making in some way. So with a cyanotype, for instance, if you have this sort of long duration exposure over the course of an exhibition, and then you get this image and kind of, you know, shades of blue and white at the end, the shade of that correlates to when in the exposure that event happened, right? And so you get, in a different way, I think, than the cloth of groundwater, but in a related way, perhaps, a kind of compression of time, but yet still some sort of representation of time there. So I'm very interested in that. And, you know, my mom is a painter, so I think that kind of, you know, the magic of music is that it happens in time, and yet I'm always kind of grasping at like the ephemerality of that, and there's something exciting about a physical, tangible, material object that you can touch and hold that, you know, folds that down into a moment in some way. I don't think that's a full answer to your question, but that's one answer to your question. Yeah.
My question might be divided in two parts. First is that because you're interested in including like physical material and let them to be interactive with music in very visual ways, I was wondering how do you approach the relationship, audience relationship between this physical material, this traditional layer that you're bringing into musical work, and how do you think of their experience with it? When you sort of decide on this you're passionate about, and also how does that inform or influence the, I guess, the process of collaborating or working with performers? How, like, does that change the performer's experience of experimenting performing their music? And the other thing that I wanted to ask about, which is part two, is more general, because those materials, they require to be very specific and to your piece, maybe like for the specific work or specific performance. So about portability, about your work, like, because for me, because I come from conservatory and I'm always surrounded by all these players who are highly trained in their instrument, but almost like 90% of them have zero experience in electronics. So the moment I open up my computer, they panic.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, how do you approach, like in general, either just electronics or even including those interesting material, physical stuff, how do you approach portability, your pieces travel elsewhere?
That's a great question. I'll maybe answer the second part of your question first. I would not characterize my work as highly portable, and yet it does get done. I think partially because I just put in a lot of labor myself. I made it clear from the get-go with Thompson Street that, like, I will adjust what needs adjustment. I will compromise. You know, they frankly are not printing the piano cloth live. They're faking it, and that's okay because we've done it enough times live now that I've scratched that itch. But other things, I said, you know, this is really important. It's important for the pitch shifts to be live. You know, the singer needs to have that control, whether it's a little MIDI controller, whether it's an iPad running Mira, you got to give her that control. And they honored that, and they did it. You know, I think when I work a lot with performers who don't regularly engage with electronics. I work really hard to make my patches as user-friendly as possible. I give them README files. I Zoom with them. You know, I told Pear the other day, I think it's great, he puts his phone number in his patches. Like, we can all think of ways to help our players out. So I think, you know, my music would get done a lot more if I wrote acoustic string quartets, and, you know, maybe someday that will be the thing that like gets my heart beating fast, but it's not right now, and I can't write the stuff if my heart isn't beating fast. So I just try my best to make the compromises that feel reasonable to me to make to enable pieces to be done in new contexts. Sometimes that means that I have pieces that have like the low tech, the medium tech, the high tech version. I literally have files labeled low tech, medium tech, high tech for some pieces. And then, you know, I just accept that. Like, sometimes I don't get performances. I had a lovely guy in Germany write me and ask me, like, do you have a piece that would fit this specification? And I realized, wow, no, I don't have anything for that size ensemble without electronics. I'm sorry, I can't help you. So that's the second part of your question. The first part of your question, in terms of like the audience's engagement with the physical materials of the piece, yeah, it's a really great question, and I think one that I want to keep thinking more about. I will say after groundwater, I always invite people up to sort of like poke around the cladding plate and touch the cloth, and like, you know, you end up with this like murky tank of water because later on dye is deposited in the water, and there's actually a cloth with a reverse image printed at one point where it's a dark cloth and then there's bleach on the pads on the hammers, and you get a kind of reverse image there. So I invite people to kind of engage with the materials. I will also say I think Thompson Street, though they're faking the printing of the cloth, they're doing beautiful stuff with the cloths in terms of they've got a dancer and they're like manipulating it physically, and they're wearing it as a cloak, and they're doing things with it that really kind of bring it into the rest of the spirit of the piece in a really beautiful way. So I think I want to keep thinking about that as an avenue for sort of deepening the engagement with the physical materials. And then, you know, I think things that sort of live life as an installation and as a piece feel attractive to me, like the piece I'm working on for Music of Houston for 2027. And then, you know, when people are in a kind of more of a gallery or installation context and they can go up and peer at things in their own time or even touch it if you will allow them, that feels really good too as a way to augment the experience that people have in the sort of performance version of the piece. Yeah?
Very hopefully jumping on a little bit on the question of audience. You talked about when you're using existing music and all of these references, and you explained that they are very personal.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how you think about reference or identifiable reference in terms of the audience.
Yeah, this is also a really great and thoughtful question. I think I share, so Ted yesterday talked about how he likes to use personal data, both because, you know, then he's not sort of unethically borrowing other people's data, and also then because he's just attracted sort of aesthetically to like personal work. I think I share some of that attraction. I think also, you know, of course I understand that a sacred harp tune might read very differently for somebody else, especially maybe somebody else who hasn't sung that repertoire, or who might like think I am, you know, a crazy Appalachian Christian. So there are risks to sort of drawing on other musics and genres in that way. If you care about people experiencing them in the same way you do, it's never going to happen in exactly the same way you do. I think that's part of why the sort of recurrence and transformation of those materials throughout the piece is important to me, because you almost get a view at them from different angles, and maybe you get to sort of triangulate a little bit what they mean to me. That Ashlingal is, you know, the sort of just the sort of beautiful version of the melody that you get in movement 10 is important, but also the sort of like effort of creating it together in movement 5 is important. And, you know, that the way that it's sort of tucked into that texture plants some kind of a seed. So I think I'm hoping that engaging with the same materials in a bunch of different ways that all feel true to me and persuasive to me will allow people to kind of get a richer sense of where I'm coming from and engaging with those materials. It's 6. Oh, one more. Okay, very last? Yeah. Yeah.
How do you engage and communicate with performers about notation that may be unfamiliar to them?
Yeah.
It's new to creative or brought and borrowed material.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm often using a kind of a bunch of different notational means. Sometimes, sometimes it's this as at least a layer of the notation, but sometimes it's this. It can be a really traditional staff notation. There's a lot of sort of box notation in this piece, and then, I give directions for what sparks those gestures. Like in one movement, it's depositing drops of dye into this tank of water, and each player gets assigned a quadrant, and when they sort of get little swirls of dye entering their frame, they're supposed to start particular gestures. So I think, knowing your players is helpful. Also just, acknowledging the fact that a new form of notation may be unfamiliar, and also being, upfront about the sort of uses and limitations of different notations. This is why I think this sort of concept of a recall notation is powerful, because not all of my notation has to perfectly capture everything. Obviously, no notation can do that, but perhaps, this notation gets closer than the graphic of the cloth, and that's okay, because, I'm working with people in rehearsal, or I'm having Zoom calls with them, or they're listening to audio from prior performances of pieces. So I think just, for me, bringing a really open spirit, being interested in what performers are bringing to the table when I am indicating greater openness to their own improvisatory voices in my notation, has gone a long way in terms of a real kind of good-hearted engagement with what I'm asking. I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer for you than that. But thank you all so much. It's great to be here.